Hello, it is Brennan here on Tuesday, the 10th of February. Flying by. I wanted to talk today a little bit about transgender terminology. Probably the most common questions I get from cis people as a trans person are, what does this mean? What does this mean? There seems to be a lot of lack of knowledge outside of the trans community about a lot of the language we use within the trans community to describe ourselves. So I'm going to clear that up. I used to teach comprehensive sex ed, so a lot of this was stuff that I have quite a bit of practice teaching. And it is hard to teach. It is hard to learn different ways of talking about gender. But I don't know. I think it's interesting, and it's always interesting to try new things. So basically, I wanted to start with what does transgender mean? Transgender, with the prefix trans means moving across, beyond, or through. For example, like transatlantic, moving across the Atlantic. Transplant, translator, you're translating, you're moving across language. Transnational, transglobal, moving across the earth. Transportation, porte is to like carry you're carrying something across a distance. I'm really interested in words just in general. I'm a huge linguistic and etymology nerd. I love prefixes. I love like kind of the building blocks and where words come from. So this is like naturally up my alley. And then the word cis, which is got a lot of controversy lately because it started to permeate outside of the trans community and reach people who are not trans. And the word cis means, or cisgender means not trans, as opposed to normal, because I'm normal, thanks. But the prefix cis, a lot of people tend to think that like trans people just like made up this word, which like, one, there's really not a problem with making up words, like that's how language happens, like new words are created. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But the word cis actually does have a history of usage outside of trans theory or gender theory, which is where it's most heavily used these days. It's a scientific word generally used in geography and astronomy and chemistry to kind of describe the structure of things and like the relative positioning of things. Cislunar means between the moon and Earth, or between a planet's moon and the planet, meaning on the same side as the moon. Translunar would be beyond the moon. Cis means like on the closer side too. Cisalpine, that's the descripting word meaning on this side of the Alps. It's really only used when you're talking about Cisalpine Gaulish, which is the extinct language that was spoken in northern Italy, so on this side of the Alps if you're in Rome talking about it. Also, let's see, cis-Neptunian or cis-Martian means within the orbit of a certain planet. If you're talking about like cis-Neptunian asteroids or asteroids that are happening within the orbit of Neptune. Also, the most common usage of it is in talking about geometric isomerism. I was really terrible at chemistry, but geometric isomerism is talking about like the molecular structures of like the geometric molecular structures of isomers, just where different molecules are located across chemical bonds. Cis and trans are ways to describe where the bonds are located. I guess it like makes more sense if you're looking at what one drawn out at an isotope or an isomer drawn out. Yeah, so basically the point of me describing that is that cis and trans are totally legit prefixes that we've used for a really long time. They're just now being applied to gender. So, like, gender, the word gender is, like, really complicated. It can mean, like, your social gender, kind of like your social role. That's expected based on your physical sex. You can also talk about gender identity, which is the way a person personally relates to their physical sex and their gender in the world. Gender tends to mean social rather than physical. When you're talking about gender theory, when you're talking about the physical components of a person, you're talking about their physical sex, which is very different from gender, which is a cultural and social concept. Genders have been really different throughout history, and they're still different throughout the world and throughout cultures, transculturally, transglobally, transnationally. So I will also get into that a little bit later. First, I wanted to talk about the trans umbrella itself and what is within the trans umbrella. Like a lot of like any umbrella term is the definition of an umbrella term. Transgender applies to a lot of different things within the umbrella. Like, Christian refers to a lot of different religions that are Christian. Catholic is, blah, blah, blah. You know what a fucking umbrella term is. So, yeah. There's a lot of different identities and words and just descriptors that lay within the transgender umbrella. I'm going to talk about a few of them. There's transsexual, which is somebody who, as the word describes, decides to make changes to their physical sex and their sex characteristics. I consider myself transsexual because I have taken steps to medically change my body. And that's probably, out of all the words within the transgender umbrella, that's the one I most readily associate with. If somebody asks me about my gender, I say I'm transsexual. A big reason for that is because I feel weird talking about the more non-binary aspects of my gender with somebody who isn't well versed in trans theory, and transsexual is a really good way of just putting a neat little it's the only one that really accurately describes my journey right now, or just in a broad sense my journey. I also think because the trans umbrella is widening and is starting to include people who don't necessarily follow the traditional trans narrative. And who also don't necessarily make physical changes to their body, that there needs to be a distinction between transsexual and people who are non-transsexual transgender people, because our medical needs and our civil needs are a lot different. A transgender person might want their gender markers changed for convenience on IDs, but they might not necessarily need all the medical care that somebody who's a medical transsexual would need. So I just think, personally, there needs to be a little bit of distinction there within our community when we talk about that. I can't really speak for people who don't make the decision to change their body, because I don't understand that. The crux of my transsexualism is my physical self and how I relate to my body. Not necessarily just my social role. A lot of trans people, there's some disagreement within the trans community. Some trans people feel like dysphoria is a requirement to be transgender. Other people think it depends on identity, and discomfort with your social role, it is enough to make you trans enough. I really dislike getting into these kinds of identity politics, because I guess I am I can't speak for people who don't want to change their body. All I understand is my own experience. So I don't really I can't say whether or not someone is allowed to identify as transgender because they don't experience discomfort around their physical body. I don't know. I'm not qualified to make that judgment, and I don't really think anybody is. And as far as trans trending, which is something that gets thrown at a lot of young people who are experimenting with their gender, and for whom it might be a phase. And it's when I was 17, 16, 15, it wasn't safe for me to explore my gender. I didn't have a place and a way to do that. And maybe it's okay. Maybe it's okay for gender to be experimenting with gender to be a phase for somebody, and them to have a safe space to go through that. I don't think there's anything wrong with playing with your gender. I really don't, obviously. Let's see. So yeah, another word that is really commonly heard that falls under the trans umbrella is transvestite. There's a huge difference between transvestite and transgender. Transvestites, some consider themselves under the transgender umbrella, some don't. Some people consider transvestite being it's a slightly offensive word for a trans woman, but I also do know people who are male-bodied who have, like a male gender identity consider themselves men who cross-dress for reasons that have nothing to do with gender identity, be it just because they like how they look. It could be like, I don't know, and it's just for reasons other than their gender. I know Eddie Izzard was somebody who is a cross-dresser but doesn't necessarily identify as transgender. I know that feel like I feel like there has to be more examples out there other than just Eddie Izzard. Yeah, I don't know. There are people out there who cross dress for reasons other than that they identify as a gender other than their body would make people assume that their gender would be. Yeah. Genderqueer. Genderqueer is another big one that people hear. Oh, it's drag queens. Drag queens are a really great example of people who cross dress for reasons completely other than gender identity. For some drag queens, it absolutely might be about, they're experimenting with something more personal about their identity through their art. Others, it's comedy. Others, it's performance. It really depends on the person. But yeah, genderqueer is another one that gets thrown around. Genderqueer and non-binary are kind of interchangeable. Gender fluid's another interchangeable one. Those are just people who don't necessarily feel like they're a binary gender, like man or woman, who kind of identify in between those. I do consider myself gender non-binary. I consider myself third gender. Some other words I use to describe myself are transmasculine, just because I'm following that trajectory from a feminine space into a masculine space. When I first started coming out, I really identified with bigender, which kind of means that the way you conceptualize your gender is two separate personas. I definitely have a more masculine persona, and then fembren, as I call her or them, and fembren doesn't come out that much. But yeah, it's changing now. Sometimes I feel like really agender, just really separate from gender in general. But most of the time, if I were asked honestly how I identify, it would be like transsexual, non-binary, and in the androgynous, in the third gender. So I tend to, when I think of just what the prefix trans means, I kind of think of myself as the beyond part of it. Like if you're thinking across, beyond, or through, I kind of consider myself in more of like the through or beyond, that I'm moving through these gender lines and like beyond. It's not so much for me that I've crossed from one polar side to the other polar side. And a lot of trans people don't really think of themselves in that way. Like it is more about the journey than like where you started and where you ended up. So yeah, it's really hard for me to answer. Like I don't identify as a man. I don't identify as a woman. I kind of just identify as a trans person. Like I plead the fifth in that department. And yeah, there's been a lot of kickback from people who aren't trans about these things. And this happens when people talk about sexuality. It's like, why do we need all these words? Why do we need all these labels, all these boxes? And the reason is because labels are handy. All these new words. Like people are so hung up on new words, and Shakespeare invented thousands of words. Rappers today invent and use language in really, really creative and innovative ways, and change the way we talk. And language is fluid. That's the point of language. If it stopped developing, and if a new word stopped being incorporated, then it would be a dead language, and it would be Latin. That's what defines a living language, is one that changes and is, I guess, also still spoken. I don't know how many. I actually wonder about that. If your language is still spoken but not necessarily evolving. I guess Gaelic is a good example. I wonder if it's living or dead, or some sort of zombie language. Anyway, an undead language. Yeah, like I said, I'm a huge linguistic nerd. But yeah, terminology is important because it gives people... language is important to humans in general because it's how we express ideas. That's what it's for. So as kind of our ways of understanding the world around us have changed, we've had to invent new words and new ways of expressing ourselves, we didn't have words for the planets that we didn't know existed before we invented a telescope. As we've discovered more about gender and about physical sexes, disciplines like endocrinology and just, perinatal, prenatal, yeah, prenatal, prenatal, you know, medical disciplines have embryology, things like that, have really yielded a lot of new information about gender, and it's chromosome studies, and as we get new information, the way we talk about it needs to change, and then the society changes with the way we talk about it, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's completely natural, and for people like me who don't have a reference point when it comes to my gender, it helps to be able to discover people theorizing about things like androgyny and about non-binary gender, and words that I do relate to, because when I look at what is a woman, what is a man, I have a lot of trouble kind of seeing where I fit in that. So it's helpful for me to see people talking about expressions of gender and of self that align where I see myself, which is as a female-bodied masculine entity that has a experience that kind of transcends what you would think looking at me, and what you think gender is, and I'm trans. I could just say it in one word, I'm trans, and just have people know what the hell that means. That would be amazing. I have so many notes right here. But yeah, language expands naturally and to communicate ideas. And something I think a really interesting thing is this isn't the first time that one group of people has been ahead of other people and then have to retroactively change the way most people talk to catch up. I think a really good example is when the French existentialist poet Rimbaud was writing in France. When people were trying to translate his work, and a lot of French poets around that time, French modernists and stuff, trying to translate them into English, there weren't words in English for the ideas that they were conveying. And so English had to catch up ideologically to what these writers and poets were talking about. Oh my god, there's a branch, but it keeps looking like somebody in my yard. It's really sketching me out. Anyway, yeah, so terminology is important. It's not that big of a deal. And yeah, I mean, even the way I've talked about language has changed a lot, because as I've learned more about gender theory, I've learned that a lot of people are uncomfortable with terms like MTF, for male to female, or female to male. Some people are really uncomfortable with that. I tend to use FTM spectrum, or MTF spectrum. I consider myself an FTM spectrum person. So when I'm tagging stuff or talking about hormones or health tips or policy stuff, I'll tend to tag it with that, because it's it's easy. I mean, I have a lot of issues with F to M, and even with female bodied, because female is also kind of an arbitrary term if you're looking at physical sex, and I've talked in previous videos about the physical sex itself isn't binary in humans. It's way more binary in birds, which I think is interesting. Yeah, so FTM and MTF are loaded terms, albeit handy. And AMAB and AFAB is kind of more preferred in trans circles, which means assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, instead of born male or born female, because a lot of trans people feel like we were assigned the wrong gender. It's not that we were born, you're born in the body you are, but somebody told and raised you that you were, told you you're a female, raised you in a female box. So yeah, we tend to prefer assigned female at birth, AMAB, AFAB, whatever. I also tend to, when I talk about myself previously, I don't really refer to myself as being, I'll say a girl, I'll say girl child, that's, I tend to think of myself that way. Yeah, I tend to use estrogen ruled instead of female bodied, testosterone ruled. That's how I tend to talk. And it really depends. It sounds really convoluted, but it's kind of an interesting way to open your mind about how you use the words that you use. I mean, I think it's good to just be aware of language in general, and I mean, language is how I'm a writer. That's like my primary art, and it's something I'm just interested in. So I mean, for me, it is just like a personal avocation to learn new words and learn new ways of expressing myself. And as I've met more trans people who have expressed different levels of comfort and different ideas about these terms that we even use within our communities and that have changed within our communities, it's changed the way I use them. And yeah, it's creative. Like that's what I like is that interchanging things like assigned female at birth and estrogen ruled and feminine presenting and making these little tiny distinctions and talking about what those things mean for different people. I just think is like really fascinating and just like mind opening and creative. And I don't know why people are so. I guess people are just intimidated by new things. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a good coverage of kind of what is in the trans umbrella. Um, I just want to talk a little bit about like third genderism, which is like I said, where I see myself as I consider myself like a non-binary transsexual. Like my gender is non-binary, and I have taken steps to physically change my body. But like the most frustrating thing about not the most frustrating thing, but a really frustrating ideological thing about being trans is that um, as someone who's third gender and non-binary, I have a lot of people say like a coworker of mine was like no one's a they, and this was said behind my back, thankfully, because I would have. Yeah, because you know what you're talking about. Anyway, yeah, like actually people have been a they, like more than two genders have existed historically and culturally much longer than there have been two distinct genders, man woman, male and female. If you look at Greek statuary prior to Hellenistic art, which was the latest period of Greek art, there's a lot of it was called hermaphrodism then, it's called intersex now, but there are depictions of non-binary physical bodies on statues. There was even a god that was hermaphroditic. I hate that word. Um, let's see, Canaanites and like pre-monotheistic Israelites believed in up to 6 genders and also separate physical sexes. Women who were able to bear children and women who were not able to bear children were considered separate genders, which I think is really fascinating. And I wonder if they were treated differently, or I mean, obviously they would have different social roles, but so yeah, that's a recognition of a different social role that we don't notice in our culture. And in India, there is a really predominant, like it's been recognized for a long time, a third gender community. Um, I forget Hajira. That's what you say. I think that's what they're called. But yeah, they've actually seen a lot of civil rights movements recently, and they've been accepted more and more in South Asian communities. But yeah, they have a context within like Indian mysticism and Indian history. Also in Southeastern Asia, there's a big context. Ladyboy thing. Don't use that word. That's not an okay word to use. But that community, I'm awful and can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it starts with a K. Um, they're actually preferred hires these days in Indonesia in the fashion industry and in customer service, which I think is because people are starting to recognize the value of trans people in the workplace and that we can bridge this gender gap. And I think that's why in the U.S. I hope to see an increasing number of trans people getting hired in human resources, in entertainment, and like I guess in fashion. That's where we've actually seen a lot of trans peoples in fashion and arts. I guess kind of obviously with the I don't know. Gender bending's always been kind of a thing in fashion. Well, not always. I think since anti-fashion started becoming a thing. So I mean, just like when I look at history and I see Plato talking about how we started as these androgynous beings cloven in two, like cursed to kind of seek our other half, and that's the origin of gender. When I see things like that, when I see these historical records of people recognizing genders other than male and female, and you look at Native Americans and indigenous people in North and South America recognize third genders who were often shamans and often considered people who were spiritual leaders and people who had authority, spiritual authority in the communities. Um, and all this has been erased by Western binarism, and that's a very Western thing. The idea of male and female, man woman being like interchangeable concepts in a split that require different social spheres really, um, yeah, it didn't really exist until Western culture started existing. I mean, I say the Greeks recognized androgynous people, but that kind of went out of fashion towards the end of the Greek Empire, whatever. And yeah, I guess they were never an empire, right? I hate Greece. They didn't like women that much. Um, yeah, so when I look at my own history, I see all these examples of not only cultures recognizing gender, but also people within the West who probably, if they had lived today, would have considered themselves transgender. I mean, with the FTM spectrum, it's kind of hard because there were a lot of reasons why people would historically have wanted to live as not female. Joan of Arc, would she have considered herself a trans man today? No one could really tell. But then there's been people like Albert Cashier, who fought in the Civil War, and unlike most female-bodied people who fought in the Civil War, who continued to live lives as women after the war, he went and worked as a man for the rest of his life and lived as a man. Dr. James Barry was a famous surgeon, a military surgeon, and a really infamous asshole. I love him. You should read about him. It was only after his death, when his death wishes were blatantly disrespected, that it was found that he was female-bodied. And so yeah, there's been examples of people in history who have lived outside of gender, but were ignored. And it's like my history has been erased, and it's been hidden from me, and I've had to go way out of my way and seek it out and find these primary sources and read about these historical figures and historical nuances with gender. And it's sad. I feel kind of robbed of something. It's because people think I'm delusional for thinking these things, and it's like, no, you could go read about this too. It's important to me because I want to have context in the world. I want to see myself reflected back in the universe. I think that's what everybody wants. To look out and see what's going on within reflected back and vice versa. I don't know. Whoa, I'm at the 27-minute mark, so I'm going to cut this the hell off. So yeah, I hope that a lot of cis people are just unclear in this stuff, and I do like to educate. I am here to educate you, kind of, when I want to. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm going to go enjoy the beautiful Texas weather today. So yeah, have a great week, y'all.